All right, welcome everyone to the DLIS webinar. This is the next to last webinar for the spring 2023 semester. Today's topic is a panel of library architects and construction managers who have completed a number of local projects uh, throughout the New York metropolitan area, including Long Island. So we'll be hearing from Pansy Cheng, Tracy Hansen, Michael Reed, and Kevin Walsh. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Uh, this discussion came about because Dr. Vorbach, our director in DLIS, met all of you at, I think it was a Nassau County Library Association event that happened last fall. And it's a topic that we cover in our curriculum. Library design is a course that's offered every 2 years by an adjunct who is a library architect based in New York City. This is an off year, so we thought it would be of value for our students to just start thinking about this topic in anticipation of next academic year when the course will be offered in the spring of 2024. So what I would like to do is relate your professional experience to our program goals. Our program goals are a replica of the core competencies for librarianship as designated by the American Library Association, our accrediting body. This is the rundown. So the first is foundation of the profession, then information resources, organization of recorded knowledge, etc. These program goals our students have to satisfy. They have to demonstrate that they have reached these goals in order to graduate from our program with the Master's in Library and Information Science. So there is value for our students in hearing your perspective on these goals. And I want to start where all things start at the very beginning, and that's the foundations of the profession. And I want to ask Pansy specifically, uh, when we think of the foundations of the profession, this is a way that we understand the role of libraries in society. And I know that part of your professional practice is community engagement and doing real needs assessments when it comes to redesigning library spaces. So could you tell us a little bit about how you go about assessing the needs of a community when it comes to a library project?
Well, it's really about marketing. This is the foundation of marketing as well, right? So to understand your users, you have marketing research, you have market segmentation, which means market research is study your users. Who are your demographics? Are they mostly seniors, young families, students, etc.? And then you split these users into different groups that segments them into different markets. And that's how you start getting, you know, creating a marketing plan to strategically plan what you need to offer the users. And then after you do that, you get feedback from users and the cycle continues. So that's really the marketing cycle. You can do it in many ways. You can do it with focus groups, you can do it with questionnaires, and of course, not just for users, patrons. You also need feedback from staff. So part of the marketing is to know your users, your staff, and the general your territory per se. With the coverage of the library and what you need to make the library as appealing and attractive and easy to use for the users and the staff.
Well, thank you for mentioning staff because I think sometimes in these processes, so much attention is given to the patron that the staff might feel left out, or they're only asked in later stages to provide that valuable feedback. And that would include information that relates to how we organize our collections. And I'm going to ask Kevin and Tracy, what are your considerations when you're designing what I refer to as back of house or back end spaces, like offices, storage? I mean, book rooms, right? Book rooms are something that are generally unseen by the public because it's storage for library collections. Um, Break rooms. Are these, how do you assess and how do you take into account the fact that we are organizing the storage of physical objects for the most part in library spaces?
I'll just start and say,
Take it,
part of what we do and what Pansy was talking about in terms of each community and understanding the community, we would think as a master plan first of the whole library and all of its components, physical and for users of different types of users. And so the back house would be balanced from the beginning, looking at the whole, and then we would go in and operate on whatever that might be back there. Tracy, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think that flexibility is going to be the key. Always flexibility and comfort, and always keeping in mind the comfort of the users. I mean, not only is this a public place that the staff is catering to, but it's also a workplace. So I think it's important to always keep those two things in balance with each other. And flexibility is always going to be the key. We can never plan for every object because who knows in a library this day what that object might be. It's such a growing breadth of information items. So flexibility is going to be absolutely key.
And I think also just to throw in a little engineering into it, it's not just architectural or interior design, it's also climate control, et cetera, based on what you are actually storing. And to know that people are back there too. So it's not just things and objects, it's people. And then the balance even of the environment that we're creating back there, because chances are it's not lots of daylight. If it's all just books or high density versus regular, the access to all that information and all those products and pieces is equally important. Make sure people can navigate back there.
Yeah, I know that we undertook an archival project. We have academic service learning in our program, and we partner with community organizations that have limited resources but have vast archival materials. And we run a digitization lab. And when we built the digitization lab, we had to request that we get UV filters for the windows. So there are large films that can be put on windows, existing windows, to make them UV resistant. And no one in design and construction, our internal department, design and construction at the university, no one knew what we were talking about, and they had a really hard time understanding the costs associated with this. And we had to justify the costs and say, these are archival materials that are from community partners, and we cannot expose them to direct sunlight haphazardly. Like our space was laid out so that the staging area for a digitization project was essentially a large table in front of a bank of windows because that's the only space that we had for it, and we needed those windows to be UV shielded so that any materials left on that desk were not being exposed to direct sunlight, which has a deteriorating effect on paper and ink. So to avoid yellowing or discoloring of the paper artifacts. And these were important correspondences and primary accounts of migration experiences throughout the history of the United States. We had papers going back to the early 20th century. So we didn't want to expose these centenary items to UV light, and it was a big uphill fight. So yeah, thank you for considering that kind of what you mentioned as climate control or environmental control in these spaces are a factor that a lot of people in the public may not understand. I was at a board meeting once for a library renovation project at my previous institution, and a member of the public stood up and said, "We need bird-proof windows because we're putting up all of these floor-to-ceiling windows, and we're in a migratory pattern." And sure enough, the architect said, "Oh yeah, yeah, we're going to use Ornalux," I think was the brand name of this glass that has inside it, invisible to the human eye, but it has this kind of iridescent filament in the glass that signifies to birds. It makes the glass wall look solid in the perspective of the bird, and so they avoid flying in and bopping their little heads. So there's a lot of consideration when we look at these spaces, and I'm so glad that now it's kind of built in uh, to what architects and designers are thinking of when they think of libraries.
And if I just one more thing, if I just say one more thing, and that's part of initial conversations too of a master plan to take into all those practical things that may not be as exciting to talk about or even to sell, but it's so important to involve it early. And as you get into cost estimating and expectations of expenditure, if you have you have it all there in the study that you can reference and discuss, then everybody knows what they're in for, and you can get people on board earlier.
Absolutely. And so let's talk about briefly what we call user services, but to you would be the desks, right? So the circulation desk, the reference desk, the information desk, any kind of uh, self-checkout kiosk that might be implemented in the space. What are your guiding principles? I'll start with Pansy. What are your goals when you're creating the public-facing interactive spaces of a library?
Well, if you're talking about reference services, for example, you know what you're offering per se, right? So what are the strengths? What are you intending to provide? So is it friendly? Is it approachable? Is it you know, reliable information? Does the circulation, for example, always get asked, where's the reference desk? You know, just to be patron facing, attractive, and also work services really needs to consider the heights of all users. For example, a children's services desk, it's going to have to be lower for kids because you don't want the kids to look up and see the bottom of the reception desk, right? So that's not good. And also consider wheelchair users, seniors who can't really see really well and has a back problem, so they can't really bend over and look. So different heights for different audiences are important. And of course, we're talking about comfortable chairs as well. If they're higher at the desk, obviously the staff needs to have stools instead of chairs and so on. And also what are displayed next to the reference desk and circulation desk and all the other desks for the users to approach and understand what their offices, what services that you provide, what information you can provide, and whether it's how to use a self-checkout, where do you go on the web to look for, books, can, etc. Does that
Yeah,
help?
yeah, that's a great answer. There's a lot of I'm glad that you're thinking of the comfort. A lot of the job for librarians is sitting at a reference desk. There are some libraries that have implemented floating or kind of wandering librarians who will be out in the stacks answering reference questions at peak traffic hours. Tracy, have you noticed maybe that there's some emerging trends in these interfacing spaces? Pansy mentioned desk height and using stools instead of chairs. In your mind, are there any kind of uh, things that librarians are requesting when it comes to these areas?
Self-check has become a big item that we've had to incorporate into these circulation areas and reference areas. So that's, again, an interfacing area that you want to make sure is accessible and comfortable for everybody to get to. Unfortunately, one of the more emerging and present trends is COVID screens and screens even for flu season, things like that. And that's really for the user and for the staff, just in being able to create a flexible barrier. We've been designing them as removable so that they could be in place perhaps during flu season and then taken away at times of, less illness. So that's been a trend. But you touched on a really great one, an exciting one is just touchdown points so that librarians are more accessible to the community by being out on the floor and not behind that big desk. Information stations on wheels that are smaller and more accessible, very different heights, things like that. That's been a great trend.
Yeah, one of our advisory board members, back when COVID first launched, he went through a library renovation 3 or 4 years ago. So he reopened, I think, the summer of 2019. And he made the point of he didn't want desktop computers. He wanted only laptop computers and tablets for his staff for that reason, because it makes the library more responsive and more flexible if you can take what used to be the info desk and now set it up for a craft or have an impromptu book discussion around that desk, and you're not interfering with someone who's anchored to the desk because they have a desktop computer. And when his library had to close, everyone was able to take their laptops and their tablets home and work from home and do remote reference and virtual programming without any additional costs to the institution. So his idea of being more mobile and more responsive ended up passing the ultimate test, which was the COVID lockdown. So that's another useful perspective on this, that if we make spaces and these interfacing places more flexible or provide more of them throughout the library, we can be more responsive to our patrons' needs, especially in times of crisis, God forbid.
Another interesting item that popped up in our crisis was the drop boxes, after hour drop boxes and pickups. That actually has become a really great item, that you can pick up things after hours, and the items that might be in need of the community, to accommodate people's different work schedules. That's become a really really nice thing for communities. Again, that flexibility, things that fell out of COVID that we didn't expect, out of need. Interesting.
Right. And I mean, and also down to little details like the fact that we spent an entire year sanitizing these surfaces multiple times a day. That's a lot more wear and tear than they might have originally been intended for. I mean, now newer libraries have kind of space age materials when it comes to surfaces like desktops, and even the bookshelves themselves are made from polymer plastics and other things that are more resilient to chemical intervention than our traditional wooden surfaces. And I know a lot of libraries kind of wore away the varnish and the finish on their antique wooden surfaces by having to sanitize them multiple times a day. That's something that we weren't expecting to see from COVID, adding an additional, taking 10 years off of the life expectancy of a wood top desk by rubbing it with Clorox every day. That was an unexpected thing. When it comes to unexpected hiccups, I want to ask Michael, who's our construction manager, uh, where do you see, maybe you don't see it, and I'll rephrase the question. Um, are there gaps in the expectations of the board of trustees or the directors and the actual realities of a construction project like a renovation or even a new building?
One of the things that has to be pointed out from the beginning is having that dialogue with those stakeholders as far as understanding what needs to be done with the building. So, as pointed out earlier by Kevin, it's really having that interactive conversation initially to point out what are going to be those expected deliverables. So once those deliverables are defined, those drawings are made, our facts as far as a construction manager is to come in there and look at the constructability of implementing that work and seeing is it feasible. Are you able to pull things together as far as what is being designed or the expectations of the owner, and let them know what is the feasibility of implementing that and making it a reality. So just make sure that clearly defining what are the roles and expectations, what are the desires of the stakeholders, has to be done up front, and then we're able to make that adjustments accordingly in the field as far as either during the design process, having that input based on our past experiences as far as working on other construction related projects, or during the actual construction process. It depends on when things are brought to our attention, we're able to do and adjust to be flexible to make sure that at the end of the day, the owner is getting the desired result of what they promise out to the taxpayers and the community.
Yeah, that's really a vital step, is always, I'm so glad to hear this from you. Pansy, do you have something to contribute?
Yeah, I just want to add that I agree 100% what Michael said, but also I would even suggest one step further is that the library already start interviewing or selecting construction managers during, say, 60% design phase, just to join in a conversation and sort of run through whether this is feasible, so that the architect avoid redrawing after the set of drawings went out. So, whatever the construction manager would in, making budgetary assumptions and what needs to be incorporated or not incorporated, there's any value engineering possibilities that needs to be, I believe that needs to be defined before the 100% documents are sent out.
Absolutely.
That's valuable. I mean, it's yeah. I mentioned to you earlier when we first met that I was involved. I wasn't involved, but I was present for a series of botched renovation projects for a library in Nassau County. And again, I kept seeing that process. I would see the architects come in and they did all of this survey. They surveyed the building and erected sensors for airflow. They did this really extensive study in the building for a week or two. Then they presented their data, then they updated their design, then they presented that to the board. The board didn't like it, they revised, and it was about 2 years of this poor company coming into the building and just issuing more and more things and changes that the board requested. And then at the end, the board rejected their final design. And it's like you wasted 2 years of this company's time. You wasted zillions of dollars in consulting fees, and it was really disappointing.
Oh, by the way.
Can I just throw? Oh, sorry, Mike.
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, we can't hear you.
All right. One of the things that Pansy pointed out was the involvement of the construction manager. Sometimes the construction manager is also engaged by the client even before the architectural engineering firm is involved. So having an early partnership as far as having all the stakeholders, people that are invested in the best interest of the library at those early phases helps to eliminate problems downstream where you're later on in the design process will possibly have to go back and do a redesign. And with having those inputs that the construction manager brings to the table, as far as, like, say, for instance, with my firm, Elite Construction Company of New York, we worked in the areas of being a general contractor, architects, engineers. We have all those skill sets that we bring to the table. So we understand how a design gets implemented by actually being on the other side of the table and implementing that physical work. So we bring that level of expertise and able to foster that in the design process to say, okay, you know what? This is not going to work out in the field, or here is how we might be able to do a little bit better and tweak the design to make it more feasible, palatable to be implemented out in the field. So we bring that level of expertise that helps with the team and the team composition in order to be successful in implementing the desired process. Program.
And I think that the overall thing that we can all agree on is to be proactive more than reactive as much as possible.
That's true of I think any professional practice.
Absolutely. But you know what? You can get caught up in tangents sometimes. And the key is to remain mindful of the bottom line and the cool stuff. It's got to work first.
Right. Well, that brings me to our last consideration today. How do we make sure that our spaces are equitable and accessible? We talked about desk height. We know, obviously, this group is aware of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which affects architecture, it affects physical spaces, and that we have to provide doorways of a certain width to make them accessible to wheelchairs. We have to provide ramps or wheelchair lifts for transitional spaces like staircases and mezzanines. But I find in my own work, I present on the topic of accessibility in librarianship, and that talks about the creation of digital media, making sure that our videos have subtitles for the hearing impaired, making sure that there are transcripts of audio for the hearing impaired, and etc. How do you manage? One trend that I've seen are sensory spaces for the neurodiverse. And these are spaces that are quieter, have subtle lighting, don't use bright colors that might overstimulate patrons with uh, whatever spectrum disorder they have. How do you bring accessibility into your practice? I'll start with Tracy.
So there's a lot of ways that just spatially we try to be sensitive when we're planning a library space. You know, there's a vast array of people, you know, from young children, babies, infants coming into a library, all the way up to seniors, which Pansy touched on earlier. So I think it's really important to make sure that, you know, you're providing the space for all those users. So, you know, space for all the strollers to come in and be parked, you know, a family to come in together to be with their little one and be comfortable and not necessarily have to sit on the floor. So gathering areas for, you know, multiple different groups, a space for teens to be comfortable. You know, you really have to be sensitive to all the different age groups. Um, you know, you touched on acoustics. I think that's really, really important in public space, you know, design is making sure that you provide areas for people that might not necessarily thrive in a large open area, but areas that are smaller, that are more intimate, you know, place that you can really tuck in for, you know, sensory issues and things like that. It might not necessarily be a room, but just a place or a space that's safer.
That brings up an issue that I'll ask Kevin about, addressing safety. When it comes to something like a children's room, we want line of sight. We want to be able to see exits. We want to be able to see the children in the space and make sure that they're okay. Um, how do you address those concerns when it comes to safety in a public space?
As well as rounded corners on all of the furniture. Things like that. Well, obviously, you know, long gone are the very tall stacks in the middle of everything, right? So immediately the perimeter absorbs as much of that mass and opacity as possible and just becomes part of the wall that's already there. And then you just try to subdivide into zones without creating visual barriers to activity and being sensitive even to, you know, if there's a little play area versus a little more focused area, try to have, like Tracy was getting at, sometimes a little nook, a corner that you could develop that's a safer place or a sense of stability away from, and that can actually impact behavior even for a small child who's not really consciously thinking about how they're behaving, but you can subtly influence how people feel in a space, whether they are consciously aware of it or not. And that's a, you know, a choreography that goes on, just, you know, arranging things.
I want to go back to accessibility and ask Michael, when it comes to ADA compliance, and we're talking about public libraries, some of them may be old and grandfathered into not necessarily having to reach ADA standards. In your experience, is that when it comes to renovations, is that ever brought to the table by the institution, or is that something that you have to bring as a kind of enforcement of ADA compliance when it comes to renovating buildings that were constructed in the middle of the 20th century?
Most of the time, that is brought up by the client with the architect and engineer to bring it up to standard on that regards, as far as implementing the ADA requirements in order to upgrade the facility. But one of the key things that we run into is making sure that when you're working in a renovated space and creating these things, that you're trying to eliminate or reduce the unknowns when you're doing this type of work, as far as creating different openings, as far as changing out plumbing fixtures, door openings, whatever's being required to bring it up to ADA compatibility, even elevator additions, whatever is being done. So it's not, you know, we understand the requirement, we understand the necessary of bringing it up to code, but just trying to figure out how to do that and how to eliminate the unknown conditions while you're doing implementing that work is a key thing. So we can try to minimize the cost of possible change orders that would be in the future. And then when you're dealing with a lot of these structures that are older, you have to also take in consideration lead, asbestos, those type of conditions that might have to be factored in the cost for making those renovations.
And possibly historic preservation issues.
Yes.
Wow, yeah, that's right. There's a lot of, like I said, very old buildings in this field, which are valuable, absolutely. But yeah, the idea of those hazardous materials and abating asbestos, especially in libraries, right? Because they were constructed in the early or middle 20th century. Asbestos was the fireproofing solution, and fire is, of course, the biggest hazard to libraries that we know of. Besides censorship, by the way. I'm just going to throw that in. I don't want to get too radical here. Pansy, what are your ideas? You already contributed a lot about your considerations with desk height and those interactive areas, but what's your kind of guiding principle when it comes to ensuring that a space is accessible?
I think a couple of things. First of all, the floor plan, the flow of the floor plan of accessing to different areas should be easily understood by a user without maybe looking for wayfinding or signage. That should be something that the floor plan needs to be nice and clean, but it's understandable by anyone approaching the building for the first time, going into it and trying to navigate their their visit. So I think that's important. Also, to also be mindful of the daylighting, for example, and also visual supervision. As you know, as we know, book stacks a lot of times are tall. If they are tall in like the adult reading areas, you might want to consider not putting them parallel and not perpendicular to a really nice row of windows so that not to block the daylighting coming in, or too high or not parallel to also the line of sight from the reference desk or the circulation desk, for example. Also consider acoustics that Tracy touched on earlier, but not necessarily separation, but and I'm sure Michael from Elite can attest to. Sometimes like the hum of a certain type of ballast has such high frequency that it really bothers people. The hum of a heater may really cause distractions to someone who wants to be in quiet reading, that kind of things that also needs to be considered.
Yeah, that's really that's something that I just found out about is that the hum of electricity can affect some people that are neurodiverse and distract them, as you said. Um, that's I guess it would be a consideration when sourcing materials, obviously, that you want to make sure that these things are kind of, I don't know if there's any kind of IEE rating on the frequency of light fixtures, but hopefully we'll get there soon enough and it'll be a lot easier to be inclusive in our designs. Well, thank you all for your contributions. This is a great topic to explore. It really opened my eyes the past few weeks looking into this and thinking about the spaces that we occupy and the spaces that we maintain and update in librarianship. You know, it varies, right? I mean, we need workspaces, we need collection spaces, we need meeting spaces. And it's great that you all are a group of professionals who are in this field, and we need, I think, there's room for more allyship and more partnership between the people that design the spaces and the people that occupy the spaces. You know, so when I go to the American Library Association annual conference and trade show, or even the New York Library Association conference and trade show, we hear from things like the New York State Dormitory Authority, which is, I guess, governs the construction of libraries and colleges and university campuses here in New York State. And we hear from vendors who want to sell us the bird-proof glass, and they're going to sell us, you know, the security gateways that we use in the front doors. But I have yet to see a presentation about a comprehensive philosophy of library design, and I think we got pretty close to that here today. So I want to thank you for that. This information is absolutely vital for our students who will be entering the field in the next year or two, and probably because of the library stock, the physical stock, will probably at some point in their career be involved in a renovation project So this is a good preview of what the process entails and what to look for when partnering with architecture, design, and construction professionals. So thanks again. I'm just going to quickly go through the kind of boilerplate here. I just want to remind our students watching that DLIS does offer a mentorship program that partners incoming or current students with recent graduates, and they help you navigate the reality of being an online grad student. So that's something to consider. Just email dlis@stjohns.edu for more information. And housekeeping, we're currently in the advisement period. April 11th was the beginning of registration. And April 27th, our next webinar, we'll hear from second career academic librarians. And those are librarians who were working in public libraries or school libraries and are now working at colleges and universities. So thanks again to our panelists. It was great to see you. I hope you all enjoy your summer. That's on my mind. I know it's not even May yet, but that's the next transition for the academic year, is that I have to start ramping up our summer students in the next couple of weeks. So thank you once again, and I'm going to end the recording now.